Okay, so welcome back. We're going to continue on to this lecture, talking about motor control. So the major decisions are going to be made regarding motor control within the brain. And what is a motor system? A motor system is the neural pathways that control the sequence and pattern of contraction of skeletal muscle. To do an activity, some muscles need to be relaxed while others are contracting. They need to change their roles in order for us to complete a full motor skills. Skeletal muscle fibers are either innervated by alpha motor neurons, where their cell bodies reside in the spinal cord, or by cranial nerves. Okay, so talking about higher brain centers. The higher brain centers will superimpose commands on the activities intrinsic to the spinal cord. Why? Because that's where the cell bodies of the alpha motor neurons are. So the higher brain centers will send info down to the spinal cord, initiate activity which is intrinsic to that spinal cord, so we can get the spinal cord to respond the way we want it to. We need proprioceptors so we can make corrections on the fly, because sometimes we can also make mistakes. So proprioceptors are kind of also another protective mechanism for us. We're briefly going to talk about different brain centers and their function. We're not going to get too in depth, but just a general overview. So the cerebral cortex, which is our outermost portion of the cerebrum, is responsible for intellect and motor control. Our frontal lobe involves high intellect and motor control. Our motor cortex is at the rear of the frontal lobe, and this initiates voluntary muscle activities. Our brainstem plays a role in postures. Cerebellum is a system of checks and balances. Our basal ganglia is pretty much our relay station. All of these areas will send info down to the spinal cord and initiate activity which is intrinsic to that spinal cord so we can respond the way we want it to. So here, here's our cerebellum, which involves movement. We have our hippocampus, memory, hypothalamus over here, our main regulating center, cerebral cortex, thought, planning, basal ganglia, which is the action, which chooses the action to perform movement, and so forth. So here's just a brief picture. Okay, so let's go over motor and muscle units. To review, a motor unit is an alpha motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it innervates. Now, what's a muscle unit? A muscle unit is the set of skeletal muscle fibers within a motor unit. So when an alpha motor neuron fires, all of the fibers in that muscle unit will respond. Each time an alpha motor unit discharges, the muscle unit will contract. All fibers in a muscle unit are of the same histochemical type. So in that muscle unit, which goes with the motor unit, is the same histochemical type. So they're the same if we were to look at them underneath the microscope. Their properties would be the same. So all fiber types, so meaning type 1, type 2, and so forth, type 2A can be, all muscle fiber types can be mixed in a large muscle, but not within a muscle unit. So you will not see type 1, type 2, type 2A, all those other things, or type 2B muscle fibers. You will not see those within a muscle unit, but you will see them mixed in, like we talked about last time, within a larger muscle. So the biceps muscle as itself, as a whole, may have a mix of type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. However, a muscle unit itself will not have different muscle fibers. Okay, so innervation ratio. Innervation ratio is the ratio between the number of alpha motor neurons and the total number of skeletal muscle fibers within a muscle. So this tells us the average number of fibers in a muscle unit. So for example, 10,000 muscle fibers and 10 motor units. This gives us a ratio of 1 to 1,000. So the average number of muscle fibers per unit in that muscle then is 1,000. This ratio will be much larger in glute muscles, back muscles, and our postural muscles, for example. And this ratio will be much smaller in muscles which require fine motor control, so the eye and digital manipulation. So we have talked about this before, that one alpha motor neuron may innervate a small number of muscle fibers. This is what this innervation ratio is talking about, because we want fine motor control with our eyes or our fingers. But one alpha motor neuron may innervate thousands of muscle fibers. For example, our glutes, postural controls. This is what our innervation ratio is telling us. Okay, so let's talk about alpha motor neurons and the motor nucleus. So the only way the central nervous system can cause any sort of skeletal muscle contraction is to initiate a discharge of that alpha motor neuron first. Makes sense? Each muscle or each group of synergistic muscles has its own motor nucleus. What's a motor nucleus? This is a cluster of alpha motor neuron cell bodies that resides within a given section of the ventral horn of the spinal cord. These cell bodies are arranged in a longitudinal column within the spinal cord. The cell bodies are somatotrophically arranged. What does that mean? That means where the muscles are located on the body. So determines where the cell bodies are going to be located on the spinal cord. So axial muscles are our postural muscles, and lateral muscles are considered our extremities. Okay, so a quick review of what our alpha motor neuron is. This has a large soma, which is the body. And then it has anywhere between sometimes 15 to 22 dendrites coming off of that soma or that cell body. The more dendrites you have, the more surface area you have for receiving incoming activity. That makes sense. We can receive different signals from different parts of the body. It has one axon right here. And in many cases, this axon is myelinated, which we've talked about, which is the myelin sheath over here. And the nodes of Ranvier are in the little gaps that are in between the myelin sheath, the gaps of myelin sheath, and that also helps up speed transmission of signal from one location to the next. Okay, so alpha motor neurons, they do not make any decisions themselves, which ultimately means that they have to be acted upon before exerting their influence on skeletal muscle. So they're going to be activated or acted on 3 different ways. So 3 primary ways an alpha motor neuron is going to be influenced. One is by primary sensory afferent fibers. So this is coming off of our dorsal root. 2 are descending pathways coming down from the brain. So this will come onto the alpha motor neuron and will dictate what it's going to do. So coming from the brain. And 3 are interneurons, a neuron which is confined to our gray matter. And this is ultimately our most common way. Okay, so let's talk about how these alpha motor neurons get these signals. When all of these signals come into the alpha motor neuron, some signals are excitatory and some signals are inhibitory. Makes sense because we need some muscles to contract and we need some muscles to relax. So that's going to determine if it's going to be excitatory or inhibitory. Something, though, must integrate all of these synapses. So we need synaptic integration. So we're going to do this in something called the axon hillock region. And the strength of the incoming signal is somewhat determined by the location of the synapse on the dendrite. So further away is less powerful and more slowly the synaptic activity occurs. And the closer it is, the more powerful and faster the transmission. Okay, so that makes sense about the strength of the incoming signal because if the dendrite is further away from the synapse, that signal is going to take a lot more effort to get to that synapse between the dendrite, and that's going to be a less powerful signal. So the closer the dendrite is to the synapse, then the more powerful and faster the speed of that transmission of the signal. So that makes sense. Okay, so let's connect alpha motor neurons and the fiber type. Alpha motor neurons appear to have the same characteristic as the fiber type that they are innervating. So alpha motor neurons that innervate type 1 fibers are smaller and the signals are transmitted more slowly. And that's okay because our type 1 fibers uses mainly oxidative metabolism and are slower anyway. Our type 2B fibers are larger and transmit the signal with great speed. So these are our fast glycolytic fibers, so we're going to have a larger alpha motor neuron and a thicker axon, which transmits the signal with great speed to those muscle fibers because we need to activate those very, very quickly. And then our type 2A fibers, which are middle of the road fibers we talked about, are somewhat in the middle. Their alpha motor neurons are not quite as small and they're not quite as big as the type 2B fibers. All right, so we're going to move on to spinal cord reflexes. And what a reflex is, it's a relatively simple stereotypical response to a defined sensory input. This is completed without conscious thought, so you don't think about a reflex. So if you think back to when the doctor or you hits your tendon on your knee and then your leg jerks forward, you don't think about that. You didn't think about jerking your leg forward. That is just a reflex. So a stretch reflex is called a myotactic reflex. Muscle spindles are receptor sensitive to stretch, like we talked about, within skeletal muscle, and they have two sensory afferents, type 1A and group 2. So a ballistic stretch reflex is a phasic stretch reflex. This occurs when we stretch a muscle very quickly. When we stretch a muscle more slowly over a certain portion of time, this is called a tonic stretch reflex. This is most important with maintaining posture. To have a stretch reflex, we must have something called a myotactic unit. Okay, what is a myotactic unit? This is a group of flexor and extensor muscles that surround a joint. So example, if we're going to have a phasic stretch reflex of an extensor muscle, this means we're going to stretch an extensor muscle with great speed. What's the protective response to that? The protective response to that is that we have to contract the extensor muscle. So in order to have contraction of that extensor muscle, we must induce relaxation in what other muscles? Our flexor muscles. So we have a two-part response. Okay, so I'm going to go through that example again. So if we have a phasic stretch reflex of an extensor muscle, what's going to happen? This means we're going to stretch that extensor muscle very, very rapidly. So the protective mechanism to that is so we don't stretch it too far and induce too much damage is going to be to actually contract that extensor muscle then. So what has to happen? That means we have to relax in our flexor muscle. So we have to induce relaxation at the flexor level. So we could use that as pairs of muscles. For example, if we overstretched our tricep muscles, if we had a phasic stretch of our tricep muscles, that's going to be a very quick stretch. So when we have a quick stretch, the protective mechanism is to contract that tricep muscle. So in order for us to then contract the triceps, our biceps are going to have to relax. So our flexors are going to have to relax and induce relaxation there. Okay, so now we're going to move on talking about interneurons a little bit. So these are neurons which are confined to the gray matter within the spinal cord. So they're right here within the spinal cord. Their activities are confined to the spinal cord only. They're referred to as propriospinal neurons. Their major role is to project to the alpha motor neurons to tell them how to respond. Remember a couple slides ago I explained how the alpha motor neurons respond are going to be influenced in 3 different ways. Our primary sensory afferent fibers, our descending pathways coming from the brain, and then our interneurons. But our interneurons are our most common way. All right, so we're going to talk about how motor signals connect with our alpha motor neurons. The more complex a voluntary movement is, the more involved the brain will become. That makes sense. The more involvement movement requires, the more the brain needs to get involved to control this movement. This means signals from the higher brain centers have to somehow get to those alpha motor neurons. They will make the decision of which alpha motor neurons are going to fire, which is going to make the decision of which muscles are going to contract and which muscles are going to relax. So are our flexors going to contract, or are they going to relax, or are our extensors going to contract and relax, and then when are we going to switch that pattern up? So 2 ways descending motor signals can get to the alpha motor neurons is what we're going to talk about next. There's 2 different ways. One is the descending signal can terminate directly onto an alpha motor neuron, which is not as common. So this comes directly from the brain right directly onto the alpha motor neuron. That's usually not as common, but it can happen. 2, the descending signal will terminate on an interneuron, and then the interneuron will then activate the alpha motor neuron. That is our most common way, and that's what we're going to continue with next. So the most common way is the descending signal will terminate on an interneuron, and that interneuron is going to dictate what happens next.